So let's begin then and get straight into it by looking at the latest from Ukraine. And as you can see, if you've looked at the latest casualty projections coming out of the Russian Ministry of Defense, the latest leaks that are coming out of the Ukrainian, unofficial media, shall we say, you can see that the offensive that's now been going on since the beginning of June and has now stretched over 10 weeks. And the estimated casualties that I've seen from Russian sources are putting it around 42,500 at least killed and wounded thus far. Now, of course, these are Russian sources. These could be overstated. We don't know for sure exactly what the numbers are, but it seems that there is no doubt now it is even making its way into the hallowed halls of the Western media that the offensive has been a total catastrophe. You can now see in the New York Times, Washington Post, on CNN, in the Guardian and the Telegraph, and even in The Economist, you can see that they are starting to tell at least some version of the truth, that this has not worked, that this big gamble that they pushed has not succeeded, that it has cost an awful lot of Ukrainian lives, but of course that they look set to continue it anyway. And that is despite the fact that they have lost, by now by their own admission. There was an article, I believe it was in Forbes yesterday, detailing how now the Ukrainians are throwing in like their last properly trained brigades to try and make a breakthrough in the Zaporozhye region, which they haven't done so far. All they have managed to do is make some indentations in the grey zone and get closer to the Russian first line of defense, and I think there's around 4 lines of defense on the Surovikin line, and all they have managed to do so far is waste tens of thousands of men dashing themselves to death against the first line without even getting close enough to the first line to make that much of a difference. Now, there's been a number of explanations as to why that is. Now, of course, there is first of all the fact that the Ukrainians don't have any air power, and therefore for the kind of warfare they're trying to wage against a Russian army that has extensive air power at its disposal, including helicopter gunships which are able to operate with very little restraints placed upon them because the Russians have so successfully annihilated the Ukrainian air defense. So without an air force, this is rather difficult to conduct. And also that this is a complaint that is now coming out of the Ukrainian side, that the NATO training that their forces have received isn't any good. Because, well, this is something that you can work out yourself, even if you've not had any kind of military training. That 12 weeks being put through your paces on a training field in France or Germany or Italy or Britain isn't going to match the training level that the Russians have, which is that their mobilized men and their volunteers have now been through, I believe it was at least 6 months of training before they were deployed. Maybe some of the guys who'd been more recently in the forces were able to go straight back in, but now all the men who were mobilized who maybe had served many years ago have gone through over half a year of training. Because bear in mind, a lot of them who have been deployed were held back for a long time inside the borders, the pre-existing borders of Russia, and trained relentlessly on the new weapon systems till they were ready to go. And they've had many, many months to prepare the defenses because the Ukrainians kept saying they were going to attack, and NATO kept leaking or saying openly, the NATO representatives kept saying openly that Zaporozhye was going to be the main focus of it. So it's the most bizarre way to stage some kind of offensive, to basically give your enemy 6 months warning that you were going to do it. Because I can remember back in December of last year when Mr. Zelensky went to Washington and presented that flag to drunk Pelosi and says, "Oh yes, we're going to attack very soon." It was all accompanied by a press blitz, which was in, I think, Zelensky and Zelensky were interviewed in Time magazine. There was all kinds of features about how They were going to punch through in Zaporozhye. They were going to take the Melitopol and then Mariupol, and they're going to cut off Crimea, and victory would follow because the Russians would crumble. And it really is just utterly bizarre when you think about it, that you would telegraph your intentions half a year in advance. And if you go back even further, they started talking about this just after the Russian withdrawal from Kherson, which was in the latter part of 2022, where the Russians withdrew to solidify their lines. So it's actually almost 8 months by the time this was launched that they've been talking about it and talking about it and talking about it. Now, I am not, the reincarnation of General Zhukov or anything, but I can pretty much be certain that if you trail your attack plans for 8 months in advance and they're not fake, they're not a deception, that you then carry it through exactly as you said you were going to carry it through, without any air cover, and into 4 lines of intensively prepared Russian defenses, then it's not going to end very well for you. And the reason I mention this is that the story came out today. It was a story that Seymour Hersh has got on his Substack, that the CIA warned Blinken before this began that it was going to be a disaster. Now, I'll say this on the Hersh stories, in fact, any story that Hersh runs, they do come from sources that are deep inside the American state. Hersh has a long address book, it seems, of disgruntled officials inside Washington who are prepared to give him a story. So first thing to say is this could be some CIA guy who presumably is fairly high up in the organization, maybe even Burns himself, who knows, or somebody acting on his behalf, basically using a leak to Hersh to cover their own asses, to say, look, we told them this was going to be a disaster, Blinken wanted to do it anyway. So there is every chance that this is just the CIA dumping on Blinken in public. But I can believe that the CIA and the Pentagon, because Milley gave some indication that he knew that this was going to happen. That's Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He gave an indication that he was very much clear that this wasn't going to end very well and was going to result in heavy casualties. The CIA would have certainly known. And as I said, the Pentagon hierarchy would have known because their analysts would have told them that if the Ukrainians attack purely using infantry with no air support other than like a few isolated missile strikes and a few isolated and easily disposed of former Soviet fighters and bombers that the Ukraine still has, then it's going to be a disaster. And that is exactly what it has turned out to be. Now, the question is, of course, well, if they knew this, which they did, and I don't believe for a second that even Antony Blinken is stupid enough to, if he did see this advice, to just believe it, because we've already seen what happens when the Ukrainians charge into well-prepared Russian lines of defense, because that happened in a more propitious setting for them in the Kherson region before the Russian withdrawal last year, when they sent, I believe it was a force of at least 30,000 men to face the Russians, and they lost at least a third of it inside a couple of weeks. And the Russians held the line in much more difficult circumstances that were more tough to resupply and had less comprehensive defenses set up. So they knew what would happen if the Ukrainians charged into well-prepared and well-manned Russian defenses. They sold this idea to the general public in America and Britain and Germany and France and the rest of the NATO countries, that the Russians would crumble and run away. Based on what? It was based on the attack in the Kharkov area in October, or late September and October of last year, when the Russian army, having had its numbers drained because a bunch of men came to the end of their contract service and just left, because the Russians weren't operating apparently a stop-loss policy, the Russian army got slimmed down to a few lightly armed units of National Guardsmen, Rossgardia, and that was who was holding the Kharkov region, which is why the Ukrainians were able to attack and make a breakthrough there, because they were basically knocking at an open door. The serious forces had all gone, so that's why the Russians had to do that call-up. And essentially were forced into fundamentally changing their plans for the war. And this, of course, resulted in the call-up and the massive expansion of Russian forces. So they were basing their idea on a complete myth. The idea that the Ukrainians had attacked a strongly entrenched Russian force and had easily won was never true. And they knew it was never true. So you have to ask the question, well, why did they do it? And I come back to a point that I've made over and over again since I started studying this question more seriously, which is probably around about May of last year, which is that the American strategy for the war is not based on anything real at all. They know very well that Ukraine can't win. So what is their hope? Their hope is just to string the war out. Now, some of the madder of them, some like, that Mike Cirillo cross-dresser weirdo who is now an unofficial spokesman in a wig for the Ukrainian forces, might believe that they're about to win, but Mark Milley doesn't. William Burns doesn't. Not even Blinken, I don't think, does. So what's the plan? Well, the plan is to keep attacking, to keep the war going as long as they possibly can, in the hope that something comes up. And then by something, I mean that the sanctions kick in, that the Russian economy gets damaged severely, that something akin to a palace coup happens, that Putin dies, or the regime gets destabilized to the point where it implodes, or something else will come along. And that's their only hope. That's their primary hope, to just keep spinning the war out, which means, and this is why you've got Ukrainian men, even those who are disabled, who are too old, who are too sick, and now, of course, Ukrainian men who've fled the country into Europe, with the Ukrainian state is looking to dragoon them back into service and drag them back to Kiev and then throw them into the Russian bayonets, because the war strategy of the United States is based just upon keeping this going as long as possible, in the hope that either A, something comes up, or B, that it drags on and on and on to the point where it goes past the 2024 election, and of course it doesn't have a political cost to the Democrats in terms of if the whole thing collapses immediately afterwards, then it doesn't matter. Then they've got the second term, and it won't destabilize things inside the American political system. So this is the brutal reality that Blinken and all the other crew in the American government, Ben Wallace, Rishi Sunak, and the military command in Britain and in France and in Germany, they all knew very well that this was only going to lead to an absolute bloody slaughter, and they did it anyway. They pushed the Ukrainians, their willing stooges in Kiev, into doing it anyway. And that's what you have to bear in mind when you see some clown on the internet or in real life babbling on about, well, we've got to help Ukraine, we've got to support Ukraine. The comeback that should always be made to this point, no matter who makes it, is that they are supporting Ukraine as a rope supports a hanged man. They are not supporting Ukraine's sovereignty or nationhood. They are destroying it. And this is the brutal, cynical reality of this war, which is that it has become purely an exercise now in wishful thinking and arse covering on the Americans' part, because they are not going to go to war with Russia over Ukraine. They can't. They can't do it because they don't have the industrial capacity to do it. Even if they commanded the industrial capacity of Britain and all of the European Union, they wouldn't have the ability to outproduce the Russian war industries based, lest we forget, on the enormous industrial legacy of the Soviet Union. They can't outproduce the Russians in tanks. They can't outproduce the Russians in ammunition. They can't outproduce the Russians in aircraft. They can't even outproduce the Russians in ships. They can't outproduce them in anything. So the only thing that they've got is the ability of the Ukrainian state to throw endless, and I do mean, well, not endless, but apparently endless amounts of men onto the Russian bayonets and die horribly in what has got to be one of the most cynical exercises that I've ever seen, and more cynical even than their activities in Afghanistan for 20 years, where they spent 20 years pretending that they were building a nation, where in actual fact they were, well, covering their own asses, pretending they were doing something, laundering money, selling opium, and bringing it back to the United States. Anything but building a nation. And in Ukraine, I mean, I must reiterate points I've made before here, but Ukraine, in terms of its sovereignty, was limited to start with, was damaged severely by the activities of the US imperialists in the so-called Orange Revolution of 2003 and 4, and then destroyed completely in 2014 during the Maidan coup. So the so-called sovereignty of Ukraine doesn't exist. It stopped existing in 2014 when they got their Banderist junta in charge, who are where the real power lies, and that is who are the most effective agents of American imperialism. Again, let's go back to the history. They have been the agents of American imperialism and British imperialism since before 1945. They ran that insurgency in the Soviet Union for 7 years after World War II. They went into exile in the United States and Canada for 40 plus years until that traitor Gorbachev caused the USSR to collapse. And by the way, exclusive for Patreon subscribers this week, I'm going to be doing an audio episode on the August coup of 1991, so make sure to tune in for that one. But to return to the point, these were the people that they brought back into Ukraine in the early 90s and that they fostered and developed, and they are the strike force of US imperialism. Just as the jihadists are the strike force of US imperialism in another region we're going to come to in a minute, which is the West African region. So this is the brutal reality again. Ukraine lost its sovereignty in 2014. It has been run by a collection of fascists, neo-fascists, and bizarre creatures and drug addicts since 2014. It is wholly dependent upon the United States, Britain, France, and Germany for its financing. It has had its land and its resources and what's left of its industry sold off and asset stripped. And before that, the oligarchy were asset stripping it to death anyway. So this is where we come back to the August coup. The August coup and the dissolution of the Soviet Union and everything that happened since then with regard to the restoration of capitalism in Ukraine just led to this point. Ukraine, in its independent years, has far less sovereignty and far less nationhood than it ever did during the years of the USSR. And this is now reaching the bloody apogee, the bloody end, when the only policy that the United States has is to cover its own arse and hope that they can spin this out until after the election. And that's it. And Zelensky and Podolyak and Kuleba and the other clowns in the Kiev cocaine clown posse are starting to work out now that they are going to be surplus to requirements pretty soon. Because you got to be pretty fucking stupid to not work this out. But maybe if you're on that much coke, it has cognitive impairing abilities in terms of if you've taken that much of it, you can't think straight. But after the NATO summit, Zelensky had to know, and as did his closest advisors, that they weren't going to get in. They keep talking about, Sarkozy, the former French president, and crook, convicted crook, by the way, came out recently, today in fact, and said, well, maybe Ukraine can join NATO, but minus Crimea and the other territories. Now, if they'd have come up with that solution 8 years ago or 9 years ago when this began, then you maybe could have had some kind of at least a temporary solution there. Wouldn't have solved the fundamental problems inside Ukraine and all the political instability, and there would have been no way that the American imperialists would have let the Ukraine project go. They could have reached some kind of settlement then, but of course they had no interest in it. Again, when you're examining this situation, there is a tendency to say, well, it happened because of point X or point Y. It happened because of a long crisis of American imperialism, which meant that they needed to find a way to cause the Russian government to collapse. And that is what they have been trying to do since at least 2007, 2006, though the hostility started before that, although they were pretending otherwise. So this is the we are now into well, it's probably going to be a long end game, but we're now at the point in the game where the puppets realize that they've been used, but Zelensky and the others, they're in too deep to pull out. They can't go anywhere. Zelensky's physical survival depends upon the willingness of the United States and the British to extract him when this all goes to shit, more so than it has done already. And as for the other clowns around him, well, their survival probably depends upon being able to bribe enough armed men to take them to Poland or somewhere else, because there's an awful lot of Ukrainians, when this all goes to hell, who will want to track down the various characters in Zelensky's office and probably extract some revenge on them. Also, the Russians may choose to level charges against several of these guys and arrest them, put them on trial in either the Donbass or in Moscow. And at that point, well, if it looks like that's going to happen, well, the Americans may choose to cut the losses with some of these guys and just eliminate them. Because there's an awful lot of dirt in Ukraine that the Americans have been up to that they don't want coming out. Now, I don't know how many of you saw the two stories that have been floating around recently. One of which was from I think his name is Kirillov, the head of the Russian nuclear, chemical and biological forces. And he made an interesting statement. I believe it was the arms fair in St. Petersburg recently. He was being interviewed by a Russian journalist, and he's made interesting statements before. Kirillov. He has said he's the head of the department that analysed what they found in the US Biolabs. Remember that one when Victoria Nuland slipped up and admitted that they had those there. And this relates to something that's a dubious figure, but I think on this, somebody who has actually done some research, which is of course Robert Kennedy Jr., who's sold himself to the Israel lobby, but who in his research on Fauci and his role has been proven largely correct in terms of Fauci's role, was saying recently that the US government under Obama banned research into certain things inside the continental United States. So, of course, Fauci, being the uber bureaucrat in charge of all this dubious research by the US federal government, took this out to places like Ukraine and, by the way, other places as well in the former Soviet bloc like Armenia, and built the biological research facilities, often in old Soviet facilities, out in Ukraine. And Kirillov was saying that this is all kinds of things that they've been experimenting on there, including bird flu, various other bacterial agents that they could unleash upon the world. And Kirillov was being cautious in his words, but he says that it's conceivable that the US is developing all kinds of strains of flu virus to launch all kinds of pandemics. And the implication that Kirillov, and I believe this is something that the Chinese authorities also hold as correct, is that COVID itself was something that was developed in a US lab. Now, here, of course, a big question emerges, which is, well, did this come out of the lab that the US government was funding inside China? And why the hell did the Chinese government allow them to do this research inside China in the first place? Those are some rather interesting questions, which I don't have the answer to. But I think on this issue, at least RFK Jr. raised the right questions, which is that, well, what the hell were they doing in these labs, and how dodgy was this stuff? And Kirillov seems to be confirming a lot of what RFK said in his recent interview with Tucker Carlson regarding these laboratories. And it's certainly the case that if you look back over the history of medical experimentation in the United States and other imperialist countries, that they are more than willing, in fact, they're very willing, to use people who are regarded as disposable as lab rats, basically. In the US, I think particularly in California, there's been a long history of using prisoners, inmates at mental institutions, and anybody else who could be easily dismissed as experimental subjects for drug testing. And also this would be relevant to the biolab question in Ukraine, because there are other reports that are coming out of Lugansk, the Lugansk People's Republic, that there were experiments going on there done by Ukrainian doctors on newborn babies involving untested drugs, often which led to deaths of newborn babies. Now, again, these are allegations coming from the Russian side at the moment, but a very disturbing picture arises regarding organ harvesting, regarding sale of babies and young children, regarding experiments on the local population carried out by US researchers or researchers working for the United States, all of which actually fits into other areas of the world where the US has established itself. For instance, even in a book of bourgeois journalism, which is this book, Mafia, some of you may have read it, it's by this idiot called Mckay, who wrote one of the worst histories of the Balkan Wars I've ever read, like a complete bourgeois hatchet job. But even in his book on organized crime, McMafia, even he is forced to concede that Kosovo is one of the global centers of the sex trade, the trade literally in women and children for the purposes of, well, essentially being raped, and also the trade in human organs. And this is a US protectorate that is completely corrupt, that is run by some of the worst people you could possibly imagine, and where stuff like organ trading and human trafficking is done almost openly and brazenly out in the open. And this is also true of certain other areas of the Balkans as well, but I think especially in Kosovo, which is a pure US protectorate, and without the US it wouldn't survive. So the US presence and brutal exploitation, up to the point of enslaving for the purposes of rape of the local population, and organ trafficking and everything else that goes along with it. This is what goes along with the US presence and of course the British presence in any particular nation, and it always has done. And this is again where we get back to the point about, well, you hear some moron babbling on about helping Ukraine. They've turned Ukraine, just like they turned Kosovo, into a laboratory. It's to see what weapons, the latest weapons do to the human body, to use a population as, again, human lab rats, to smuggle babies out of there, to smuggle children out of there, to traffic women into the sex trade, to use it as a place of money laundering. This is what US imperialism brings to nations. It's nothing but destruction and hyper-exploitation in the most hideous way you could imagine. And so this is what helping Ukraine actually means. It means mass slaughter on the battlefield. It means the reduction of the country into a place where organized criminality can thrive. And some of the worst things that the Nazis were charged with, human experimentation, etc., that carries on inside these US protectorates, inside Ukraine, inside Armenia apparently, and several of the Central Asian nations all have these biolabs in them where human experimentation is apparently carried out. This is what being an ally of the US empire ultimately entails. It means selling your population to essentially be slaves. And I don't use that word lightly, but if you're basically allowing the US to pump what is regarded as your surplus population full of drugs, untested drugs, infect them with plagues, use them as cannon fodder, traffic the women and the children, sell people's organs, then what other word is there to describe what's happened to Ukraine other than that that nation has been enslaved? Right up to and including, of course, the enormous amount of debt that has been inflicted on the nation by Zelensky and his clique that will, of course, remain there forever. And so whatever is left of the Ukrainian state, if indeed the Russians allow such a thing to exist, will be owned forever by the holders of that debt. There's no other way to describe it other than to say that the Ukrainian nation has been enslaved by the US empire, because that is what has happened. And to see this dressed up as freedom or helping Ukraine, it's a sick, sick joke. And if you possibly can, we should all say to people who use these stupid words about helping Ukraine, get a few bullet points to fire at them if you can, about what the US has actually done to that country. Because what they've done to it is largely all the things that they actually accused Stalin of doing: starving the nation, brutalizing the population, enslaving it. Well, the US has actually done all of those things, just the same way that Hitler did all those things. And that's just the nature of imperialism. It reduces the subjugated countries to the status of slaves, which is what they've done in Ukraine. It's what, by the way, the Belarusian Juan Guaido, Tikhanovskaya, would do to Belarus. She's been popping up again recently, babbling about freedom. This is a sick joke. Like freedom, look at what has been done in Ukraine and ask what kind of freedom is that? Freedom to die, freedom to get in debt, freedom to be injected with the next plague, freedom to have your organs harvested, freedom to have your children taken off you and sold to Jeffrey Epstein or whoever his successor is. Because that's all the US and the British imperialists have brought to Ukraine, and it's all that they will bring to any other nation that is put in the firing line next. So I will pause there for questions because I'm aware I've been talking for a little bit. So hello to Zuleika, hello to Chris, hello to Kenneth from Norway, and good evening to Irish Partisan, our comrade in Minsk. Hello to Jerry. Apparently Zelensky has signed martial law until November. Yeah, and no elections until the war is over. So basically no elections ever again in Ukraine until it ceases to exist. Irish Partisan says, latest news, the Russians won a big tank battle in the south today. I did hear about that. I see that the Challenger 2 tanks have finally made an appearance with a net cast over the top of them to try and stop Russian drone attacks on them. I wonder how many of them got destroyed. I'm betting it's quite a few, because only 14 were provided. So if those are reduced to a smoking ruin, it's going to be severely damaging for what's left of the British military reputation. Banana Bender says Roman Empire 2.0. Well, Roman Empire lasted longer, I think, but I get what you mean. Lachlan says, will Zelensky be assassinated? This is an interesting question. They seemed to trail the assassination of Zelensky by saying, well, the Russians have a plan to kill Zelensky, which they don't really. I mean, if they wanted to kill him, they could have done it very quickly. I think that their way of considering this seems to be that they will allow Zelensky to hang with Ukraine and be destroyed along with it, and then be evacuated out of there. Scott Ritter used to insist last year that the Russians wanted him to sign a capitulation document. I don't think they're even going to get a capitulation document signed. I think they're just going to have to, and they're going to, as I've said before, they're going to have to take Kiev, and at that point, once that's done, then the Ukrainian state will probably cease to exist. The Americans may, to save face, try and reconstitute something in Lvov, but again, like, the question is, well, is any of this going to be acceptable to the Russians now, given that the time for negotiations is apparently gone, and the Americans aren't going to negotiate before the presidential election, at least not openly. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens. But to answer Lachlan's point, if he does get killed, it'll be by his own people or at the instigation of the Americans or the British. Because if he loses it and starts threatening to spill the beans, I mean, this is a conceivable scenario, is that Zelensky, confronted with the fact that he's not getting NATO, he's not getting EU membership, the US 101st Airborne is not going to land at Gostomel Air Force Base and bail him out, that they're going to let him hang, he may start making threats. He's an unstable, coke-addled actor. If he starts making threats about maybe doing a video and shooting his mouth off about what was promised to him in secret, maybe some embarrassing things that have been said behind closed doors, I can imagine that they'll kill him and blame it on the Russians. We're dealing with some incredibly ruthless people. Zelensky means nothing to them. He is a tool at best. And if it's more advantageous to them that that tool is disposed of, then they'll do it. They'll probably try and make it look like a Russian missile strike or something. But that's what they do. They would probably prefer that he goes down with the ship, but Zelensky probably isn't that brave. So yes, if he's killed, it'll be his old friends in Britain and America who did it, or there'll be some kind of internal coup in Ukraine when it's obvious that the shit's hitting the fan, and somebody, maybe Zelensky, maybe somebody else from the ultranationalists, tries to stage a coup and takes out Zelensky himself and tries to seize power. That's also a possibility. But my instinct is that these guys lack the ability for independent action. Like, I don't think that the hard right in Ukraine, the Banderists and the fascists and the others, I don't think these guys tie their shoelaces without a written permission slip from the CIA, to be completely honest. So, do I think Joe Biden is satanic? Telltale39 asks. Well, look, I don't believe in Satan or God, so I don't think that he is satanic, because I believe in neither of those things. I would hope that if the Prince of Darkness did exist, that he'd pick a slightly more charismatic Antichrist. But maybe the devil has outsourced a lot of his work these days, and this is what we end up with: bargain basement Antichrist. It would be a big disappointment if that was the case. I was hoping for demons crawling out of a lake of fire, and instead we get some dementia-riddled old man falling up the steps of an aircraft. Right. Good evening to Burke, and good evening to Dingo Ate Me Baby. Hello to DE. Hello to Kent. Along with the revisionist approach to Ukrainian history. Not quite sure what you're referring to there. Are not free ports, charter cities, investment zones along the same lines as what's been done in Ukraine? In a way, the way in which this has been set up is that let me try and put this the right way. Free ports, etc., in Britain are a scheme to try and get around certain aspects of taxation and labour law. So the principle that the ruling class wants to apply is that they would seek to bypass a lot of labour law and tax law in certain areas. They would love to set up a special economic zone and just eliminate all labour law, working hours, all that kind of stuff. So it's the plan of the ruling class that they would love to do stuff like that. They are unable to do stuff like that at the moment because there's still too much, even though the unions are led by complete shitheads in this country, there's still too much of a resistance level present from the working class that would stop them from doing a Ukraine type option. But the basis of your question, Jerry, is correct in that they would happily do to the British population what they are doing to the Ukrainians. They're just afraid of the response if they did try and do that. And that's the reason why they're constrained. It's not out of any humanitarianism or love for the British working class. It's that they're worried that if they did try and do that, there'd be too much resistance, essentially. The AfD are soaring in Germany's polls. Surprising. That isn't a surprise. And to handle the question of, like, well, what is going to happen with the AfD? There's been talk of banning them. There's been talk of like restricting them. The German state's talking of just flat out removing their ability to stand in elections. I don't think that they're actually going to do it. I think that what the tactic is in the German state, now they may go nuts and just do it, but my thoughts are that what they want to do is to discipline the AfD leadership. That's what I think they want to do. They want to make it so that the AfD leadership goes down the same route as Meloni in Italy, which is where she is allowed to do loads of like social conservatism, but they are constrained in terms of, Meloni is constrained in that she's got to stay part of the EU, because of course that's in the fundamental interests of the Italian ruling class, and she's got to stay in NATO and stay in the alliance with the United States. All of those are fundamental interests for the Italian ruling class. The AfD will probably be told something similar through back channels from the German bourgeois, which is that, well, we're prepared to let you take over because the CSU, CDU are damaged beyond repair. The Social Democrats are fucked. The Greens are deeply unpopular, and the FDP are too. So we need somebody to step in. So, well, why don't you step in a coalition with the CDU? And you're not allowed, though, to damage the EU. You're not allowed to damage NATO, but you are allowed to do anti-immigration stuff. You are allowed to do certain other things in your program that don't threaten our fundamental interests too much. So you're allowed to give the illusion of an alternative, which is what Maloney is doing. She's the illusion of an alternative. So that's what I think all the talk about banning the AFD is actually about. It's about scaring and disciplining their leadership into essentially playing a certain role for the German ruling class that is acceptable to them. Dropping all the radical stuff about rapprochements with Russia, about threatening the EU, about threatening NATO membership, about reasserting German sovereignty. All of that at the moment, the German ruling class doesn't want to engage in. But what they are looking at is the need for a reconstitution of the German political system around a new balance of forces, and that means the AFD, because that'll give them the ability to get some more legitimacy for the next government, with the idea that this is an insurgent force that's broken through. And then what you do is, rather than just banning it or doing what the Americans tried and failed to do with Trump, which is basically trying to stop him from taking office or jailing him, what you do is you just break them down. Now in that they were successful in the United States, which is that Russiagate successfully broke down Trump's resistance to worsening relations with Russia, and also the faked gas attacks in Syria got him on board with doubling down on the war in Syria, or at least recommitting to it. And this is what's being done with regard to the AFD. It is a discipline operation by the ruling class. And I strongly suspect that the people who run AFD will probably take that bargain. Power in exchange for not Philbin from Rhode Island. And Ilensky, this is from Dingo Ate Me Baby, is less than a tool. I take good care of my tools and don't break them on purpose. A broken tool is to be discarded. Yeah, well, that's what's going to happen to him. To answer Lachlan's point, yeah, I'm from a Catholic background, but have given it up, basically. Giving up Catholicism is a slow process, but it's one which you have to reach in the end. And it was preventing me from fully developing a materialist analysis, and was leading to eclecticism and idealism in my thought, which I wanted to get rid of. And I don't believe in the Almighty or Satan anymore. So, greetings to Philbin. Chris Bernardel asks, what are your thoughts on unequal exchange? How do the current and potential conflicts impact the global system of production and value extraction? That's an interesting question, Chris, and it's so interesting. Do you mind if I put that into the Q&A for this weekend? Because I think that that's a question that is probably going to take me at least 20 minutes to answer, and I would like to take the appropriate amount of time to do so. So if you can indicate in the chat whether you agree to this question going into the weekend Q&A, I would be grateful for that. So I'll take that and put it in the weekend Q&A. So dictatorships are imposing WEF policy really hard. Look at Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, or Latin America. Well, there is a very interesting conversation to be had about green policies and what's been going on in Africa, for instance. Like the bribery of the South African government to give up their coal plants has created a severe energy crisis in South Africa, which is causing an awful lot of political instability. So this is an interesting question, which again I think I'll need to take more time on. So we're coming up to close to the 50-minute mark now, and I've only got an hour tonight. So I was going to go into the Russia-Africa summit in Niger, but I think I'll just take a few more questions and then I'll come back to the questions on Russia, Niger, etc. in the near future, probably tomorrow. So what else have we got coming in here? First few chapters of Capital are vital reading for any comrade. Absolutely correct, Lachlan. President Lukashenko said today that Ukraine may lose all of its territories if it continues to fight. Well, Lukashenko said some interesting things about this recently. He has said that he, as the president of Belarus, objects to the idea of the Poles taking over the territories of Western Ukraine, and this would constitute a potential threat to Belarus. And of course that stands in contrast to some of the hints that Putin has given in the past, with the idea being that this is something that was potentially acceptable to him. So who knows how this is going to play? I mean, the Americans wanting this to spin out as long as possible. I mean, I think personally that if the US thinks that it could gain an advantage by making the Ukrainians fight literally up to the Polish border, and if they could manage to get that to work for them, then they'd do it. The question is, does the Ukrainian state even retain the capacity to mobilize any men? And as I've said before, I think that the longer term plan of the Americans is to basically run an insurgency in Ukraine. An insurgency I think that will fail quite quickly, because the Russians are very experienced now, following all of their experience in Chechnya and in Syria, of clearing up the terrorist gangs that the US runs. So we'll see how it goes. But I think that I think in the end, the most likely outcome now at this stage looks like Ukraine ceasing to exist. If it collapses completely, and if the Russians and Belarusians aren't prepared to let the Poles rebuild the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, or try to, and there'd be questions over whether even the Germans would go for that as well, there is every chance that Ukraine loses everything up to and including Lvov and up to the Polish border, which again, I don't think the Russians would have wanted when this started, but they may be left with no choice. They may end up having to take the whole thing, which of course includes Western Ukraine, which was never part historically of old Russia, the old Russian Empire, when of course Ukraine wasn't really anything other than an idea that was floating around inside the heads of people who were being funded by the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which is where a lot of this Ukrainian nationalism originates from. It originates from the time when the Russians and the Austro-Hungarians, the Russian Tsardom and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, were competing over influence in what was once called Ruthenia, and were funding and cultivating different elements of nationalism inside each other's vast land-based empires. So this is where a lot of this stuff comes from, and it's part of the reason why Putin didn't want to go all the way to Western Ukraine. But he might not be left with much of a choice. If the choice is either take the whole thing and basically run the risk of having a hostile, or something of a hostile population on your hands and having to deal with that, or you leave Western Ukraine in the hands of the Poles, who then fill it full of missiles anyway and continue to threaten Belarusian security by gaining more territory to their south, then he may decide ultimately that, well, fuck it, we'll go all the way to the Polish border and we'll deal with the consequences. So again, I'm going to be very interested to see how this turns out. The one thing the US wants to avoid more than anything else is a sudden dramatic Ukrainian collapse, because that would expose them severely. That is the one thing that they are desperate to avoid. And anything else, though, is on the cards, including forcing the war to go on for another year. Though, according to various reports I've seen from Russian sources, something of an offensive in the winter is going to come. Now, of course, what that looks like is anybody's guess. Given the very cautious way the Russians have approached the war so far, if they've reached the point where they've exhausted the Ukrainians, they may choose to strike quickly, take Kiev, and see if the Ukrainian state collapses after that. Because if they do manage to do that and Zelensky runs away, then it is game over. But then again, that raises the question of, well, what happens if the Ukrainian state just implodes and the political leadership flees? What then happens to Western Ukraine? So again, there's so many variables here. We need to keep analyzing and reanalyzing the situation. So, okay, so evening to Ben, comrade from the CPGBML, and DE said, I was just about to ask how Russia will deal with Western Ukraine. I think in the end, yeah, I mean, Irish Partisan says a sudden Ukrainian collapse would spook the Poles and the Americans and force them to intervene. I don't know about the Americans. I don't know if I agree with you about that. The Poles are twitching and itching for an opportunity to get in, which is why I think part of the US state doesn't want, or is desperate to avoid, a sudden Ukrainian collapse. Some, like the CIA director Burns, I think, much prefer the scenario of the slow collapse. That over the course of 18 months or so, the Ukrainian state just slowly implodes until it disappears completely. And then, of course, the Americans declare, well, we tried our best, we tried everything. And if the Russians end up running the whole thing, following a slow burn conquest, and it doesn't leave the Poles with much room for maneuver, and I think that would be an outcome that the Americans would prefer. Now, as to and this might be part of the reason why the Russians are moving so slowly, is that they want to keep it at a certain point of intensity, the conflict that is, that doesn't force the hand of the nutters in Warsaw. Forget the Baltic states. I mean, basically just a bunch of yapping dogs. Another group of parasitic bourgeois who've run their countries into the ground. And hello to Red Star Betty and hello to Alexandros. Yeah, so thinking about the way this is, I mean, there is undoubtedly, on some level, even though it is not officially admitted to at all, some kind of communication going back and forth between Moscow and Washington. We know that there's military-to-military communication between Milley and Gerasimov, and we know that there is discussions going on between Naryshkin and Burns. They have met directly. I don't doubt that there are messages being passed back and forth between the two. So it is conceivable, and again, this is my speculation, I have no evidence of this, that there is a constant dialogue going on about an acceptable level of intensity. And I'll give you an example of this. When the Russians were really going after the Ukrainian energy grid, I believe it was in the latter period of 2022, you started to see the Ukrainian state start to wobble and start to look like if this carried on, they were going to have to evacuate Kiev. And if they evacuated Kiev, that would probably be game over. And that would be very destabilizing for Central, Eastern, and indeed Western Europe, because there would suddenly be millions of people fleeing to the West, and they didn't want that. So, and then that was after a long period of time when they were hammering the Ukrainian energy grid with bombing raids. They toned that down and started going after the air defense more. Now, do we think there that there was some kind of communication behind the scenes from the Americans to the Russians to say, hey, if you carry this on, then this is going to escalate and we can't have a sudden collapse and a refugee wave hitting Europe because that's going to make us look incredibly bad. So can we proceed with the war in another way? Now, again, this is my speculation, but I think that there have been ways in which the Russians and the Americans communicate with each other and say at certain points, well, if you do this, then that's going to be an escalation. Can we find a way to do something else? It certainly explains why, or it's part of the reason why. Again, there's never just one single reason for any event. There's never any one single reason why the Russians don't just storm into Kiev and take it. There's a whole list of reasons. But I do think that on some level the conflict is being managed, and part of the management strategy from the American side is to try and avoid that sudden collapse. Because if they'd carried on the bombing of the energy infrastructure to the point where Ukrainian cities just lost power, because as many have reported, Kiev still has all the lights on. There's still an active nightlife there, as there is in Lvov. There are bombing raids and there are explosions there, but you can still turn the lights on. You can still get fuel for your car there, be it petrol or electric. And of course, the gas supplies to Europe are still running across Ukrainian territory. And now, interestingly enough, I think one of the Kiev cocaine cloud posse said just the other day that, well, we might cut this off. So, but that's another thing that the Kiev clique will be told is not on the cards, and they'll be told that by the Europeans and the Americans. So the conflict is being managed, I think, in some way, not completely, but there are clearly certain levels that are agreed upon, which come up to being infringed largely by the Americans and then go off the boil a little bit, then come back on again. So again, part of the reason why the Russian approach has been so slow burn, I think, is that there is varying levels of acceptability that are being tried out between the two. And on one level, you could say, well, that's better than the whole thing just spinning out of control. But of course, for Ukraine, it is no consolation, because even if the Russians and the Americans are managing things to some degree behind the scenes, that is still the Ukrainian male population, and now increasingly the female population, being hurled into a meat grinder, which of course is no positive outcome at all. But we have to bear in mind that on some level, the conflict is being managed, even if it's just to avoid an escalation to the point of spinning into all-out war. So these are all things that I think have to be kept in mind when trying to assess what the next move here is going to be. So I now have to knock it on the head and go and do some more writing on several other things. What I'm going to do, I said I was going to talk about Niger and West Africa. So I think what I'll do is I'll do a specific West African stream tomorrow night, starting probably at around about 8 again. So I hope you will be able to join me for that, to be advertised on the Telegram group and of course on Twitter, or sorry, X, sorry Elon. Until then though, thank you for joining me, and I'll be back with you again tomorrow.